A taxi driver picks up a silent woman in a blood-red dress on a rainy afternoon in 1962. Hours later, he hears on the radio that a woman has been murdered at the very address where he picked her up, and the woman in red is never seen again. This is one of the most infamous unsolved murders in Brazilian history, and by the end of this video, you'll be asking yourself the same question investigators have asked for over 60 years. Who really killed her? Before we dive in, if cold cases like this one keep you hooked, do us a favor and hit subscribe and drop a like on your way in. It helps more than you'd think, and it makes sure the next mystery lands right in your feed. Now, let's get into it. Cold cases are, by their very nature, agonizing, because they offer us almost nothing to hold on to. Most of the time, there are no leads, nothing that can be pieced back together, nothing that can be called a hopeful fragment of the puzzle. The truth often simply dissolves with time. But sometimes that silence lies. Sometimes it's only the first layer. It was in the harsh winter of 1958, in the town of Green Valley, that fate began setting the pieces in motion for one of the darkest chapters in the region's criminal history. During a routine afternoon tea, the youngest son of Nicholas Clayton, patriarch of one of the area's most influential families, made an announcement that would forever change the course of his family's life. Edward Clayton, a respected local councilman, revealed that he intended to run for a seat in the state legislature in the capital. His relatives responded with applause and smiles. The news was warmly received by everyone present, including his young wife, Margaret, and the couple's daughters. Margaret, however, knew what leaving would mean, giving up local prestige, certain family ties, and the comfort of a life she'd built over the years. In exchange for a fresh start in the capital, she'd need to adjust to an entirely new routine. More than that, she knew her husband well. She knew that with his charisma and ambition, victory was only a matter of time, and like a devoted wife, she followed him, without knowing that this move would drop them both directly into the center of a nightmare, one that would ultimately involve her own death. 4 years had passed since the Clayton family relocated to the capital, and Edward had settled into his influential role in state politics. Everything seemed to be going well for the family. The Jacobist couple was seen as a picture of success at the time, at least until the eve of winter in 1962. On a Wednesday afternoon, June 20th of that year, the capital was gray and rainy. A light drizzle fell as taxi driver Anthony Spencer drove down Barron Street, in the heart of the Windmill Hills neighborhood, an upscale area known at the time as the Governor's District. Between the windshield and the rain, Anthony was looking for a passenger who had called for a ride just minutes earlier. That's Bao, when he spotted a woman. She appeared suddenly from behind the heavy wrought iron gates guarding a 2-story mansion at number 406. As he pulled up, Anthony found himself watching her closely. Something about her caught his attention. Maybe her posture, her elegant walk, or the way she held her small umbrella in one hand. Even wrapped in a thick red dress with a collar and cuffs trimmed in pale fur, her feminine curves were unmistakable. That impression, though, faded quickly the moment she got into the cab and showed no interest whatsoever in conversation. Throughout the ride, the woman stayed silent, staring fixedly out the side window. And as an experienced driver, Anthony quickly sensed this would be a quiet trip. Still, he noticed a certain nervousness in her. She kept adjusting her seatbelt and smoothing her dress. When they reached her destination, on Salgado Filho Avenue, she paid the fare and stepped out in a hurry. Anthony carried on with his night and, a few hours later, headed home. With a cup of coffee in hand, he switched on the radio and was met with breaking news. According to the announcer, a brutal murder had taken place at number 406 on Barron Street, in the Windmill Hills neighborhood. Anthony froze. Just hours earlier, he'd picked up his mysterious passenger from that very address. The victim was Margaret Irene Clayton, 38 years old, wife of State Representative Edward Nicholas Clayton. That night, Anthony couldn't sleep. The next morning, he got in his cab and drove aimlessly through the streets of the city, stopping only when he spotted a newsstand. He bought the morning edition of the local paper and among the day's headlines found the story about the murder. According to reporters, the victim, Margaret Clayton, had been found brutally beaten, lifeless, at the foot of the mansion's staircase. Her face had been completely disfigured, and the murder weapon remained a mystery. No part of the article mentioned a woman in red or a taxi of any kind. The article also noted that the police investigation was being kept strictly confidential, a detail that pushed Anthony to go to the police station the next day, even fearing the consequences of coming forward, worried he'd somehow be tied to the mysterious passenger he suspected might be the killer. Anthony chose to report everything he remembered. He described the pickup address, the woman's appearance, her elegant posture, the color of her dress, the time of the ride, the silence throughout the trip, and her visible unease. Within hours, Anthony's account was splashed across the front page of the local paper. Suddenly, the entire city knew about the woman in red. The story summarized the driver's statement and reported that police had launched a search for the unidentified woman. The brutal, baffling murder now had a face attached to it, and the public, desperate for answers, began eyeing any woman in red clothing or anyone acting the least bit suspicious. But the woman in red vanished as suddenly as she'd appeared. The murder of Margaret Clayton, on its own, already had everything the local press could ask for. A brutal, cruel killing of a beautiful, elegant woman belonging to the city's elite, the wife of an influential politician, a devoted mother of 3 daughters, a constant presence at high society events. In the public eye, Margaret represented the perfect woman, the legitimate heir to her family name. But the presence of this mysterious woman in red made the tragedy feel even bigger. A shadowy figure who, like Margaret herself, carried an air of elegance and supposedly moved in the same elite social circles. It didn't take long for the press to give her an official nickname, the Lady in Red. The Clayton case exploded into public consciousness, but there was one important detail. The Lady in Red might never have existed at all. Everything suggested the story had been invented by the press simply to sell papers. That suspicion grew stronger when taxi driver Anthony Spencer began giving contradictory statements. He claimed he could no longer recall the passenger's features. Investigators, for their part, never found a single trace of her existence. And yet, despite the confusion in his account, Anthony never once denied picking up the woman, nor did he ever admit to fabricating the story. And so, an added layer of mystery formed around a case that was only just beginning. With no results in the search for the Lady in Red, Detective Julian Morris turned his focus to Edward Clayton, the state representative and husband of the victim. Edward's first formal statement came on June 25th. According to his version of events, June 20th, 1962, was meant to be a special day, the couple's 18th wedding anniversary. Early that morning, the two of them had planned to spend the day with their daughters, who were staying in Green Valley. They had coffee together and arranged to meet downtown at 11 a.m. After saying goodbye, Edward headed to the state legislature in a company van. The day went on as usual there, reading documents, reviewing paperwork, skimming the newspapers, until close to 11. At the agreed time, he met Margaret on the main shopping street. They walked together along the crowded sidewalks, chatting and window shopping. At one point, they stepped into Mason's, the city's most traditional jewelry store. Margaret was immediately drawn to a row of sparkling rings, and Edward understood the hint right away. He knew she'd given her old ring to their eldest daughter, Susan, and had been waiting for a new one. Even so, he played it cool, pretending not to notice her interest. What Margaret didn't know was that he'd already made up his mind. He'd come back alone later, buy the ring, and surprise her with it that same evening. Around 11:30, Margaret asked Edward to drop her off at a shop in the Navigators neighborhood, where she wanted to buy a cap for their daughter Susan. After finishing their shopping, the couple had lunch at a small Spanish restaurant on Andrade Neves Street. Back at the house, before heading back to work, Edward picked a few fresh tangerines from the garden and headed to his office. Margaret stayed home alone. In the middle of the afternoon, Edward returned to Mason's and bought the gift for his wife. As he left the jewelry store, he was caught off guard by a sudden, heavy downpour that soon blanketed the whole city. The idea of driving to Green Valley later that evening in that weather began to worry him. In his statement, he said he decided to postpone the trip. Back at the legislature, he went up to his office and called home, intending to let Margaret know about the change of plans and maybe arrange something for the evening. But to his surprise, no one answered. It seemed odd, but not alarming. Margaret could easily have been in the bath or stepped out briefly to run an errand. Trying not to jump to conclusions, Edward came up with a new idea, making the most of the rainy evening by planning something special in the city. He picked up the phone and invited his brother, businessman John Clayton, and his wife Sylvia to dinner. The couple was very close to Margaret, and giving her the ring in front of them, Agati could make the moment even more special. On top of that, Edward learned that the legislative session scheduled for that afternoon had been canceled following the death of a cabinet minister. With the free time, he took care of a few pending errands. One in particular. He said he stopped by a flower shop where he bought a young flame tree sapling, a plant Margaret had always wanted for their garden. Around 6:30 that evening, Edward arrived outside the home of his niece, Emma Clayton Reeves, in the Petropolis neighborhood. According to his statement, he and Margaret had arranged to meet there in the evening. But to his surprise, Emma told him Margaret wasn't there and hadn't come by at all that afternoon. Worried, Edward decided to check with other relatives for information. His first stop was the Bella Vista neighborhood, at the home of another niece, Laura Clayton Kessler. He didn't find Margaret there either. Edward decided to head to his brother John's house, but first made a quick stop at his own home, where he honked the horn a few times outside the gate. No response. The house sat dark and silent, with no sign of Margaret anywhere. At John's house, it was his sister-in-law Sylvia who answered, and, noticing Edward's growing distress, tried to help. She called the beauty salon Margaret usually visited, but no one there had seen her either. Sylvia then mentioned that John was out at a bar with his business partner, Charles Meyer. Anxious, Edward decided to head to the bar himself, driving across town at high speed, and to make matters worse, ended up in a minor car accident along the way. Luckily, the collision was minor, and after a brief exchange with the other driver, both agreed to cover their own damages and move on. It was already past 8 p.m. when Edward finally reached the bar and found his brother sitting with Charles Meyer. He tried to keep his composure, but quickly revealed that Margaret was missing, and no one seemed to know where she was. In his statement, he recalled that the three of them had a brief, somewhat tense exchange, even a joke or two mixed in. Charles joked that maybe Margaret had run off. Edward smiled, but the worry on his face was obvious. With concern mounting, the three men decided to head back to the Clayton residence. When they arrived, they found the house completely dark. Edward went in, made his way to the garage, and opened the back door. That part of the house had ongoing electrical issues, so he had to feel his way through the dark hallway to reach the main circuit breaker. But when he finally flipped the switch, the scene that greeted him was pure horror. Margaret's body lay on the floor, covered in blood. Edward claimed that, in his desperation, he threw himself over his wife's body, and both John and Charles confirmed the scene exactly as he described it. Still, Edward's statement left Detective Julian Morris uneasy. The sheer amount of detail was striking. The detective later learned that Edward had written down every moment of that day in a journal, keeping the facts sharp and clear in his memory. At first, Julian didn't realize this precision had come from direct advice from Edward's own father, Nicholas Clayton. Worried, the patriarch had urged his son to write down every single detail on paper. According to him, even an innocent man can look guilty in situations like that. A written record would prevent any contradictions. He'd always repeat the same version, no matter how many times he was questioned. But this strategy backfired, raising suspicion instead. For Detective Julian, the sheer richness of detail in Edward's account pointed to guilt, coldness, and premeditation. When questioned by reporters, Julian didn't hold back. Anyone who hands over such a meticulous itinerary right after a tragedy is hardly acting naturally. The detective's accusation pushed the press to raise their own suspicions too. In those early days, Edward's name appeared in headlines right alongside the Lady in Red. That perception only began to shift when journalist Frank Bishop, a political columnist for the local paper, publicly declared that he believed Edward was innocent. Frank was a well-respected figure with a strong track record of activism. At just 28, he headed the State Student Union and since 1959 had written a regular column for the paper. After securing a meeting with Edward, Frank described finding a man he barely recognized. Edward's appearance reflected sheer fragility, a far cry from the image he'd carried before the tragedy. According to Frank, the representative was emotionally shattered. In the next edition of his column, Frank dedicated the whole piece to the case, laying out the facts and highlighting the visible grief in Edward's every gesture. In the journalist's opinion, that alone was enough to believe he was looking at a devastated husband, not a cold-blooded killer. And Frank's stance proved decisive. While many were hunting for someone to blame, the journalist offered a more human perspective on the situation. Amid the storm of public opinion, the representative, who had been well liked by many before all this, began gradually winning back the public's trust. In a way, Frank's support worked, and the investigation into Margaret Clayton's murder began taking new turns. In early August 1962, journalists themselves staged a reconstruction of the crime scene. According to the press's version, Margaret had been killed in a moment of rage. Based on information from forensic examiners, they reported that the attack began on the second floor of the house. At some point, whether pushed or trying to flee, no one could say for certain. Margaret stumbled or was forced toward the curved staircase that dominated the center of the home. Her body would have tumbled down the steps, striking the wood repeatedly before collapsing at the bottom. The attacker continued the assault even after Margaret had fallen, defenseless, to the floor. Her face was brutally destroyed by blows from a blunt object. The murder weapon was never found. Days later, it was noted that a fireplace poker was missing from the mansion, a heavy metal object, more than capable of crushing a skull. The crime scene revealed a great deal about the killer's emotional state at the moment of the attack, and yet there was no sign of forced entry whatsoever. No broken doors, no shattered windows, no fingerprints. No other trace evidence. Whoever committed the crime came and went like someone familiar with the house. At the time, it became clear to both the public and the authorities that this wasn't a botched robbery, an attempted assault, or an accidental death. This was personal. In the moment of the crime, the killer had been angry at Margaret specifically. During this period, a new witness emerged, a fortune teller and medium known as Madame Nora, who claimed Margaret had come to her for readings. But the claim was quickly called into question. Margaret was known by family and friends as a religious woman, someone unlikely to seek out a fortune teller. On top of that, the social divide of the era made it improbable that Margaret would have had any contact with someone like Madame Nora. So suspicion circled back to the Lady in Red, though not to the mysterious figure herself this time, so much as to the social circle she supposedly belonged to, the city's high society. This line of investigation gained real traction after the discovery of a specific piece of evidence, a trace of fur found beneath Margaret's fingernails. Analysis suggested the material came from a mink coat, a garment traditionally worn by women of the local elite. Following this lead, investigators zeroed in on a group of regulars at the city's famous nightclub, the Riviera. When questioned, none of the women admitted to wearing a mink coat on the day of the crime. In their statements, they all insisted that wearing mink during the day, especially in that kind of rain, would have been seen as tasteless and lacking in elegance. The lack of progress with this evidence led the local paper to openly criticize the forensic team's work. According to reporters, no one had bothered to consult a fur specialist to confirm whether the fibers found under Margaret's nails were actually mink at all. There had been no comparison against samples either. The entire theory rested purely on the assumption that the fibers looked like mink. They mistook a cat for a hare, the article read, and that wouldn't be the last time the investigation would come under fire. Later, it emerged that the circumstances at the crime scene itself had been just as problematic. When police first arrived, the scene was already compromised, with politicians milling about from room to room. Even after the area was supposedly secured, journalists reported that friends, acquaintances, politicians, secretaries, and even political candidates kept jostling for space alongside investigators. Some people at the residence went as far as opening windows, doors, and rummaging through rooms on their own. One person even stepped in the victim's blood, leaving a footprint that, for a brief period, was actually treated as a serious lead by police, a grave mistake. Amid the chaos, the detective tried to run a coherent investigation, working against a backdrop thick with rumors and contaminated evidence. With no solid trace of the killer, any detail became a starting point. Proof of this came when, during a brief stretch when he shifted focus away from Edward, the detective turned his attention to a new suspect, Sandra Fields, an 18-year-old woman. Sources described her as magnetic, blonde, green-eyed, with a slender figure and long, well-shaped legs. A woman who, many said, would suit a red dress perfectly. The kind of features that turned heads anywhere, especially at a place like the Riviera. Sandra entered the case after one night of heavy drinking, when she climbed up onto one of the club's sofas and shouted, at the top of her lungs, "I'm the lady in red." The news reached the detective quickly, and sensing the seriousness of the situation, Sandra fled the city, kicking off a manhunt. She was eventually located in the town of Millbrook and taken into custody. At the time of her arrest, she was wearing a red wool cap, a detail the investigators found more than a little ironic. The detention, though, produced nothing concrete, and before long, Sandra was released. But the real bombshell was still to come. The impact hit when the local paper published a story claiming that, during an interview, Sandra had confessed to dancing with Representative Margaret Clayton one night at the Riviera. Edward never responded to the accusation. Even so, the report pushed the detective to summon Sandra publicly through the press. Either she came forward in the Capitol to give a statement, or she'd be arrested again. The detective even hinted there might have been more between Sandra and Edward than a simple dance. Once again, the representative chose silence. The pressure, however, brought Sandra in. To everyone's surprise, the young woman held up under interrogation. Though she cried at points, Sandra stood firm and insisted she'd never personally met Edward, and that she hadn't even been in the city on the day of the murder. Regarding the incident at the Riviera, she claimed she'd simply been drunk, and that the whole thing had been a joke. The detective, unconvinced, decided to call in taxi driver Anthony Spencer once more. Despite his increasingly shaky testimony, Anthony remained the only real piece of evidence against Sandra. When he arrived at the station and looked at her, he stated with confidence that she was not the woman he'd seen that rainy afternoon on June 20th. Even so, the detective remained fixated on the theory. The investigation's focus then shifted to a small group of 3 women who, according to the local paper, might have some connection to Margaret's murder. 2 of them were publicly exposed. Their names, addresses, and workplaces splashed across the newspaper's pages. Curiously, one of these women hadn't shown up to work since the day of the murder. She'd locked herself inside her home and instructed her daughters not to open the door for anyone. The 3rd suspect was treated with more caution. All that was known was that she was a young blonde woman living in Green Valley. Unlike the others, there was more consistent evidence against her, sent in through an anonymous letter full of insinuations, all of which were checked by police. But, as tends to happen with rumor-driven investigations, the days passed, and the so-called trio of ladies lost momentum in the inquiry. The headlines, once full of stories about them, gradually faded. In the end, it became clear that, like so many other threads in this case, the trio was just another sensational chapter that led nowhere. The same thing happened with the gardener, Anthony Ferreira, an epileptic man who also worked as a police informant. During the investigation, he was called in for questioning multiple times, and after assaulting his own wife, he began to be treated as a suspect. Digging deeper, investigators discovered that Anthony had missed work on the day of Margaret's death, and that among his belongings were some curious items, a shovel and a small hatchet. Both later went missing. In his statement, Anthony also concealed the existence of a metal file, a detail that raised investigators' suspicions since the object could have been connected to the crime. In the end, Anthony swore on the lives of his children that he wasn't the killer. Investigation ultimately confirmed that the shovel and hatchet never actually existed. The file was real, but wasn't enough on its own to incriminate him. So Anthony was cleared. Just as public attention on the case seemed to be dying down, a new suspect emerged, this time from a circle much closer to the Clayton family itself. The new name was Louis Fenwick, 17 years old, nephew of Edward Clayton. As soon as word of a new suspect spread through the newsrooms, fresh details began to surface, including the fact that Louis was already known to police. His name appeared in the theft division's files with 3 prior records, 2 for petty theft and 1 for auto theft. What really weighed against Louis, though, was that just days after Margaret's murder, he'd brought a pair of blood-stained trousers to a laundromat on Columbus Street, just a few blocks from where he lived. When he handed the pants over to the owner, he tried to explain the blood away with a quick excuse, claiming he'd hurt himself in a household accident. Ronald Fitzner, the laundromat's owner, was called in to testify, tightening the net around Louis. In his early interrogations, Louis fell into contradiction after contradiction. One version in the morning, a different one by afternoon, and by the middle of the night, his explanations had grown increasingly muddled. Meanwhile, the trousers were seized and sent to the Forensic Institute for testing, but it was already too late. The fabric had been washed, making it impossible to draw any definitive conclusions about the origin of the blood. Another name surfaced, John Ferris, also a teenager with a police record for theft. According to neighbors, he and Louis were practically like brothers. On the day he heard about Louis's arrest, John rushed to the police station, visibly distressed, demanding to know why his friend had been detained. That very act ended up landing John in custody himself. Investigators also received an account from a taxi driver who described a strange episode involving John Ferris on the morning of the murder. According to his statement, the young man had flagged him down at a bar on Columbus Street and asked for a ride to Marshall Floriano Street. Once there, John got out for a few minutes, got back in the cab, and told the driver to circle slowly through several streets in the neighborhood. When they reached Barron Street, right in front of the Clayton residence, John asked him to slow down even further. The behavior caught the driver's attention. The route ended right back where it began, at the same bar on Columbus Street, where the John got out without offering any explanation. Even so, both Louis and John Ferris were released on a legal writ, since police lacked sufficient evidence to hold them. Meanwhile, Detective Julian kept shifting between different lines of investigation. In some statements, he concentrated his suspicions on Edward Clayton. In others, he expressed strong distrust of Louis and John, but he never clearly explained how these names connected to the case. Perhaps not even the detective himself really knew. He was simply trying to hold on to some sense of control over the investigation. Months later, Louis drew attention once again. He was caught trying to break into a store alongside 2 accomplices. Arrested again, he was sent to a juvenile detention facility, where he remained under close supervision. That in April 1963, in a desperate act, he attempted to take his own life inside the institution. Public opinion saw the episode as yet another sign of guilt. And as the city kept spinning new versions of the Clayton case, fresh rumors began to circulate. Among them was the theory that Margaret had been harassed by her nephew, Louis, an uncomfortable idea for the era. Other versions soon followed, including one claiming that Louis had broken into the Clayton residence looking for money to buy drugs and had run into Margaret in the process. Another version claimed Louis had broken in searching for morphine, a drug that, according to rumors, Margaret used frequently. On that particular point, it was confirmed that Margaret did, in fact, use morphine. Following an accident back in December 1959, that day, she'd been in a nearby town with her daughters, visiting factories and shops in search of shoes. On the way home, stepping out of the car in front of the mansion where she lived, Margaret tripped and fell. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a simple fall. But soon she was overwhelmed by increasingly intense pain, to the point where she could barely walk. The prescribed medication couldn't control the pain, and morphine became a key source of relief. Over time, though, the rumor about the morphine took on a different shape entirely. It was no longer just that Margaret used the medication. People began saying she'd developed an addiction to it. Her family, for their part, denied every one of these accusations, insisting firmly that Margaret was never addicted to morphine. With that, the rumors involving Louis began to lose steam. In their place, a new tragedy struck the region, one that, in its own way, pushed the truth behind Margaret's murder even further out of reach. It was Saturday, August 31st, 1963, just over a year since the Clayton case had begun. The day broke muggy in Green Valley, with temperatures already climbing toward 90 degrees. Many families were home preparing lunch, tuning in to the local station, Radio Green Valley. At that hour, the broadcast featured Edward Clayton, who had proposed a live debate with his political opponents. The subject was a $50 million Cruzeiro fund earmarked for paving one of the town's major roads. The city council had rejected an agreement with the state transportation department, stalling the project in the middle of political disputes. Edward was looking for a direct confrontation with his opponents. But only one councilman agreed to appear, Floriano Marshall Reeves, known simply as the Marshal. With the others declining, Edward decided to turn the program into something closer to a monologue. He opened with his remarks, leaving the Marshal free to respond if he chose to. And that's exactly what happened. As soon as Edward finished, the councilman sat down in front of the microphone. Unlike Edward, who was aligned with the moderate party and well regarded in rural areas, the Marshal belonged to the old Labor Party, a sympathizer of the populist movement, and carried the label that unsettled conservative families in the region: communist. Even among those who didn't particularly like him, the Marshal knew how to command attention. On air, he called Edward a shameless liar. Edward responded calmly to the insults, until the Marshal did something unexpected. In the middle of a string of accusations, he smiled and closed his remarks with a chilling line. And a suspect in his own wife's case. That final sentence had everyone glued to their radios. Edward, moving quickly, headed straight for the room where the Marshal was still speaking. And then something strange cut off the broadcast. The audio from that morning played out roughly like this. But to make an accusation like that, well, that's far too easy, especially coming from someone the papers themselves have called a suspect in the matter concerning his wife. And the representative makes these accusations. Then came a sharp crack, a gunshot, followed by the dull thud of something falling, a man's body hitting the floor. Radio Green Valley went dead air. In kitchens and on porches across town, people spun their dials, trying to recover the station signal. And soon enough, many began to piece together what had just happened. For most listeners, the conclusion seemed obvious. Edward Clayton had killed the Marshal. After all, Edward was known for never backing down from a confrontation, and he had a history of clashes on the floor of the legislature. Within minutes, the Marshal's supporters marched toward the radio station, armed with shotguns and revolvers, ready for vengeance, certain the presumed killer was still inside. But the scene they found was something else entirely. When they stormed the building, there was no sign of either politician. Staff told them it was actually Edward who had been shot. This version stunned the crowd, since the Marshal, despite his provocative temperament, had never been seen as someone capable of pulling a gun. And soon, the truth came out. Witnesses said the marshal had grown agitated when he saw Edward stride into the studio with his hand raised in a gesture meant to calm things down, saying, "Stop." All of this came right after the accusation about Edward's wife. As it seems, the marshal misread the moment entirely, and in one swift motion, drew his own revolver from his coat pocket and fired. The bullet passed through Edward's hand and struck him in the chest. He collapsed heavily, unresponsive, though rushed to the hospital immediately. His death was confirmed shortly after. The marshal fled the station, but later chose to turn himself in. Detective Mark Ibarra, now holding the shooter in custody, moved quickly to protect him, aware the councilman was at serious risk of being lynched by an outraged public. Edward Clayton's name was already echoing through the streets as that of a political martyr, and plenty of people were prepared to take justice into their own hands. To prevent the worst, the detectives sealed off the roads around the police station and called for backup. The response from state security forces was swift. Patrol cars arrived from other parts of the state, and a tripod-mounted machine gun was rushed to Green Valley. Within hours, it was set up on the station's rooftop, aimed squarely down the main street, a clear warning against any wrong move. Despite the tension, though, Green Valley never descended into chaos. In truth, Edward Clayton's allies were focused elsewhere, on giving the representative a dignified, symbolic funeral. The wake, held in the City Hall's main hall, drew massive crowds. The funeral service itself took place at the cathedral in the capital, every pew filled. Meanwhile, back in Green Valley, Detective Ibarra discovered that the weapon used in the shooting didn't actually belong to the marshal. According to the investigation, the revolver belonged to another councilman from the same party. When questioned, that politician explained he hadn't been able to get into town during business hours to buy ammunition, so he'd asked the marshal to hold on to the gun and pick up the bullets for him. The marshal confirmed this version of events, but to the detective, the story sounded like a lie. After all, buying ammunition didn't require having the actual revolver in hand. The marshal claimed he'd acted on instinct the moment he saw Edward storming into the studio, fearing he was about to be attacked or killed. That's why, he said, he drew the weapon and fired, calling it self-defense. He further argued that he'd known Edward since childhood and was certain he was about to launch into a violent confrontation. But that explanation failed to convince Edward's political allies and certainly didn't sway his supporters. For much of the community, the killing looked calculated, a cold, deliberate plan to eliminate a political rival. The first person to voice that suspicion publicly was Arthur Freeman, an influential politician and longtime ally of Edward's. In an interview with two reporters from the local paper, Freeman stated flatly that the murder had been premeditated, but the tension surrounding the truth behind the killing lingered for 2 more years. Then, in June 1965, in court, the marshal's young defense attorney, Peter Simmons, argued that his client had never explicitly called Edward a murderer, that the marshal had simply drawn a parallel. Throughout the defense, Peter walked the jury through the full context leading up to Edward's death, delivering it with real emotional weight, even offering praise for the victim. He knew full well that the town would never forgive an attack on the memory of a political martyr. Peter went further still, placing much of the blame on the press, arguing that the newspapers had hounded Edward relentlessly, pushing him to the very edge of his sanity. Curiously, the speech drew applause in the courtroom. The judge seemed swayed by Peter's version of events, and the sentence that followed was surprisingly light, just a 1.5 years in prison. Since the marshal had already served part of that time in pre-trial detention, he was released almost immediately. But his freedom didn't last. Unsatisfied with the ruling, the prosecutor's office appealed, and the Court of Appeals accepted the case. A new trial was scheduled for December 10th of that same year. This time, Peter Simmons couldn't move the jury the way he had before. In the second verdict, the marshal was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. At the local jail, the former councilman changed his demeanor and came to be well regarded by fellow inmates. Over time, he took over the prison's bookkeeping and even became a teacher, helping dozens of inmates learn to read and write. He spoke openly about all kinds of topics, but always avoided mentioning Edward's death. After serving his sentence, the marshal relocated with his family to a small town, where he took a modest bookkeeping job at a rice company. The former politician seemed determined to start over, choosing silence and anonymity for himself and his family. 10 years later, he retired, living out his days as an apparently ordinary man, seeking even more distance from his past. He moved once again, this time to a coastal town further south. In his new home, he had another child. He lived out his final years in even greater seclusion until he passed away at 80 years old on April 8, 2004, from a brain tumor. Many say that, in the end, the marshal was little more than a scapegoat, successfully used to eliminate one of the capital's most prominent political figures. Edward Clayton, a man who'd built a strong reputation through his work, but who also carried the unsolved mystery of his wife's death, all while somehow still holding on to the public's support. Edward, without a doubt, was a man whose presence made a difference in every sense. As we reach the end of this story, one question remains. Who killed Margaret? According to Richard Dunn, the author whose research inspired this case, the culprit wasn't Edward. But in Richard's own words, that conclusion rests more on circumstantial analysis than hard proof. He also points out that journalistic ethics at the time left much to be desired. Many reporters were willing to bend the truth in exchange for a good headline. Because of that, the journalistic record on this case is riddled with holes and dubious accounts. In conversation, Richard remained open to the possibility that new evidence could still surface, explaining that the entire purpose of his book was to spark exactly that kind of discovery. To this day, he holds on to that hope. Looking closely at the information from the book, we've been able to piece together a few theories of our own, ones we actually shared with the author himself. But before laying them out, a bit more context is needed. After all, as former FBI profiler John Douglas once put it, the answer to a crime is usually the most obvious one. Let's start with Louis Fenwick, Edward's nephew, someone who checked nearly every box for a likely killer, especially given that the laundromat cleaned his blood-stained trousers before any forensic testing could be done. We'll never know whose blood that really was. Another important piece comes from Christine Clayton, Edward's youngest daughter. In one account, Christine recalled being just 9 years old when her father gathered his 3 daughters in a room. In a tense tone, he told them to brace themselves for accusations and rumors, warning that many people would call him a murderer. Hearing this, Christine questioned her father, since she believed the real culprit was Louis. Edward's response was a sudden loss of composure. He insisted Louis would never commit such a crime. After all, Louis was family, the girl's cousin, the son of Edward's sister, Julia. Christine, though, says her father's reaction only reinforced her suspicion that Louis was the killer and that Edward was trying to protect him. It seems Edward had always been especially hard on his nephew, who struggled with drug problems. On more than one occasion, the representative had even struck the young man. Christine also remembers moments when she saw her mother, Margaret, gently stroking Louis's arm, trying to calm him down after one of Edward's outbursts. Behavior considered unusual, especially by the standards of the era. The suspicions surrounding Louis don't end there. In November 1976, he himself reinforced the dark shadow that had followed him for years. In a newspaper article from that period, Louis's name appeared alongside descriptions like drug addict and thief, followed by a disturbing new story. Consumed by rage, Louis reportedly began harassing his own cousins. In one such incident, Christine, by then an adult, heard her apartment doorbell ring. When she opened the door, she found Louis visibly unstable, shouting that he'd killed Margaret and that he wanted to claim one more victim. He then turned and disappeared down the hallway. The next day, the phone rang at the home of Susan, another of Christine's sisters. On the other end of the line, Louis made direct threats against Susan's son. He never followed through on them, though. The last the family ever heard of Louis Fenwick came in 1981, when he was found, shot in the head and rushed to a local hospital. He died shortly after arriving, at just 30 years old. His shooter was never identified. Like so many cases tied to the criminal underworld, Lewis's death disappeared into an investigation that was never treated as a priority by police. Curiously, it wasn't the first time Louis had cheated death. Years earlier, he'd survived being shot during an armed confrontation with police. From adolescence on, Louis had carried a clearly criminal profile. Ed's thief, an addict, prone to violence. The question lingers, could Louis Fenwick have been the one who killed Margaret, the woman with whom he seemed to share such a close, unusual bond? The answer remains a mystery. The doubts surrounding Louis are nearly impossible to dismiss, but other details led us to some new theories of our own here on the channel. These involve Edward himself. It all starts with the representative's alibi, which we might describe as suspiciously perfect, almost novelistic. In his account of the day, Edward comes across as the picture of a devoted husband, strolling through the streets with Margaret, taking her past shop windows where a piece of jewelry caught her eye. According to Edward himself, he pretended not to notice her interest, planning to return later to buy it. The couple then went to lunch, and afterward headed straight home, where Edward was the last person to see Margaret alive. In the hours that followed, Edward made a series of decisions that, curiously, built themselves into a near-perfect alibi. He went back to the jewelry store, stopped at a flower shop for a sapling, and later justified postponing his trip because of the rain. He then called his own house, where, for the first time, he noticed his wife's absence. He claimed the couple had arranged to meet at his niece Emma's home, and it's here that the mystery truly begins, since Emma stated she'd never even heard from Margaret that day. For some reason, Edward then chose to visit a string of other relatives' homes. Everyone gave the same answer. No one had seen Margaret. Before finally returning to his own house, Edward even stopped by his brother's place first. In fact, at one point, he pulled up directly in front of his own home, but rather than go inside, he simply honked the horn, hoping for some sign of life. Only later, accompanied by his brother John and Charles Meyer, did Edward finally show any willingness to actually enter the house. Was Avassayer, that only because he was no longer alone. Once again, Edward was surrounded by witnesses at every turn. In that moment, he was seen as an anxious husband searching for his missing wife. Even though he could have gone straight home without speaking to anyone, he instead chose a long, roundabout path, one that ensured he was seen and heard by several people close to him. Only after all of that did he finally step into the house, walking through the dark until he found Margaret's body. Beside her corpse, Edward collapsed to the floor, the perfect portrait of a devastated, innocent husband. But looking at the facts, who can really confirm the couple actually planned to meet at Emma's house that day? Or better yet, who can confirm that day's timeline was really as flawless as Edward described it? To reinforce this narrative, Edward explained that his own father had advised him to write down everything that happened, right up until he found the body, a form of protection that ended up producing an account so detailed it almost feels like he'd rehearsed over and over exactly how to build the alibi of an innocent husband. And the question that remains is, what motive would Edward have had to kill Margaret? To answer that, it helps to look closer at the victim's profile. Margaret was young, slender, and likely drew the admiration of many men. She spent long stretches of time alone, kept to her own routine, and maintained an unusual closeness with her nephew Louis. On top of that, she may have been struggling with a morphine dependency. Among the effects of that kind of addiction is the way it distances a person from physical and emotional pain. However determined someone might be, pain wears people down and often pushes them toward whatever relief they can find. Edward, meanwhile, was an older man, prone to unpredictable moods and entirely consumed by his political career. He likely wasn't always equipped to handle a younger wife who may have been struggling with dependency. Of course, all of this remains speculation, built from context that supports certain possibilities without directly accusing Edward. who is no longer alive to defend himself. Continuing along this line, looking closely at Edward and Margaret's routine, it's possible to imagine that the day of the murder wasn't the romantic scene Edward described, but rather a day marked by tension. Perhaps another instance of him struggling with the strain of living alongside a wife battling addiction. Christine's own account shows how Edward handled people with drug problems, much like his treatment of his nephew Louis. Throughout the story, several accounts point to the representative's explosive temper, describing him as a man prone to episodes of violence. Putting these pieces together, it's possible to imagine that he and Margaret had a heated argument that day. In many cases of domestic violence homicide, the attacker concentrates the blows on the head or neck, ranging from strangulation to beatings. Margaret showed no signs of sexual assault, only repeated blows from a blunt object, one that could just as easily have been wielded by a desperate thief as by a husband overtaken by rage. Following this same line of reasoning, there's also the figure of the famous Lady in Red, who could have been a mistress of Edward's, someone he trusted, and someone he may have reached out to right after the crime, someone who helped him compose himself and begin constructing his series of alibis. As bad luck would have it for the representative, his encounter with taxi driver Anthony Spencer ended up placing this woman right at the center of the case. And perhaps that's exactly why Edward may have helped her disappear entirely. If we accept that the Lady in Red truly existed, her disappearance would only make sense with someone's help. After all, if she'd been a wealthy woman, her sudden absence would have drawn attention quickly. But if she was one of the many young women who came to the Riviera from other towns, chasing a better life in the capital, she could vanish without a trace, with no one in the city to notice or ask questions. This theory gained some weight from the fact that, right after Margaret's burial, Edward stayed in the region for several days before being called back to give his statement. His whereabouts and actions during those days remain unknown. Today, the Lady in Red has become something close to a legend within this case. But it's worth remembering that taxi driver Anthony Spencer was very real. Even though his statements grew increasingly unreliable over time, he was, after all, the very first witness in this story. If the woman in the red dress really did leave the Clayton house that morning, that makes her the one person with any real possibility of knowing the killer's identity. Some even entertain the theory that she herself may have committed the crime. Could she have been a jealous mistress, protected by Edward? It's a valid theory, but far too risky, since there isn't a single piece of evidence to support it. It's worth remembering that Margaret never stood a chance against her attacker. Whoever it was, they were physically stronger than her. In the end, little can be said with absolute certainty, beyond the simple, painful fact that Margaret never received justice. In his book, Richard Dunn argues for Edward's innocence, but concludes that the representative knew something capable of not just tarnishing his reputation, but of destroying his life and his family's along with it. The Clayton name itself seemed to hang in the balance. It's entirely possible Edward lived out the rest of his life bound by a pact of silence, one that consumed him right up until the day of his own murder, all to protect something or someone, maybe his nephew, maybe his sister, maybe the family name, or maybe, just maybe, the enigmatic Lady in Red.